Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Welcome back, Richard.
It's great to be here with you.
Well, I thought we'd exchange some ideas and perspectives on the old debt ceiling charade, the charade that comes up every 2 or 3 years, in which there's all this controversy about, the government's going to be shut down and the sky's going to fall in. And you go through all this tremendous charade over whether the debt ceiling should be raised or not. And the reason it's such a sham is because everybody knows what the outcome's going to be, with the mainstream press calling for, the sky falling in and Chicken Little and the president going off on tirades. And then you got the Republicans, of course, always threatening to, we're going to really shut down the government this time. We're going to enforce the debt ceiling. The result's always the same. They raise the debt ceiling, thereby enabling ever-increasing amounts of debt to be piled onto the already mountain of debt. And then the whole charade starts over again, because as soon as the debt ceiling's raised, nobody starts calling for reductions in government spending in order to prepare for the next debt ceiling that's going to be coming up in 2 or 3 years from now. And instead, it's the exact opposite. They say you got to keep priming the pump with all this increased spending. In the meantime, you've got this mountain of debt that statists say, it doesn't matter anyway. We owe it to ourselves. It's what they used to always say. I think some of them still say it. But I think it's a very, very bad situation. What do you think?
I totally agree with you, Jacob. The fact is that when George W. Bush came into office in 2001, the accumulated federal government debt at that time was about $5 trillion. When George Bush left office 8 years later, it had doubled to around $10 trillion. Now, under Barack Obama, it has nearly doubled again. It is it'll be, after this fiscal year, practically $19 trillion. So it has practically doubled again in the 8 years that Obama has been in the White House. Now, of course, this doubling of the last 8 years is on a higher base than the previous doubling. So in absolute terms, this is a huge magnitude. And in fact, while the deficit this year, as calculated by the Congressional Budget Office for the U.S. fiscal year that ended on September 30th, was a mere $435 billion. The CBO does projections based upon entitlement programs, existing discretionary levels of spending, expected tax revenues based upon current tax legislation, so on, what the budgetary scenarios will be for the U.S. government looking 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. And the fact is that because of the growth in Social Security, Medicare, and of course now Obamacare, and the subsidies that come with that, the Congressional Budget Office is saying that by 2025, if not sooner, we will again see the annual $1 trillion budget deficits of the federal government. And that by that time, again, based upon their calculations, their projections of taxing and spending, the accumulated national debt will be over $25 trillion. This is a huge amount of money, a huge amount of money. One way of thinking about it is that if we were to pay off what is the national debt right now, okay, which is approximately almost $18.5 trillion or so, it would be necessary for every person in the United States to write a lump sum check to Uncle Sam equivalent to $300,000. Well, gee, I know you're just sitting around with that kind of idle cash. So, Jacob, that's no sweat off your back. But for the mere ordinary folks like the rest of us, but that just gives you an idea of this. And you are absolutely right. It is a charade that every time this issue of the debt ceiling comes up, because Congress technically has to legislatively approve a raising of how much higher the government's credit card limit can be lifted. They just do this brinkmanship for public relations and appealing to their base, and then it's just raised. The fact is they've just done that. They have allowed the debt of the U.S. government to grow over the next year and a half approximately by another about $85 billion. That's what they've agreed to. And at the same and that represents additional government spending. Now, they say, but we're adjusting for this. There's going to be more spending in the short run, but there'll be less spending in the longer run. And in fact, if you look at the projections, they're expecting some of this money to be repaid in the sense of higher taxes or lower spending in the future in 2025. Well, that's a different person in the White House. Those are different politicians in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And there's no legal binding. These are the politicians' usual false promises to be able to get benefits in the future while imposing further burdens on the citizenry, benefits in the present and burdens in the future. Now, if I can continue with this, why does a debt ceiling matter? Or why did the more traditional policy before, especially the New Deal of the 1930s, why did the principle of a balanced budget matter? That is, if government was to spend, it had to assure and explain and impose some tax that would dollar for dollar cover what the government was going to have as its expenditures. Now, many economists and political policymakers used to argue that this imposes a certain fiscal discipline on the government. This is particularly emphasized by the free market economist and Nobel laureate James Buchanan in a book that he wrote quite a while ago called Democracy and Deficit. What he explained was that for the first 150 years of the United States, the U.S. government, as in fact Great Britain over across the Atlantic too during that time, basically followed a fiscal constitution. Now, in our U.S. Constitution, as I know you know, it is not necessary, it is not obligatory for the U.S. government to run a balanced budget, like many state governments under their constitutions are required. It's the discretion. But that was the policy that if you look over the first 150 years of the United States, it usually followed, where the government basically had a balanced budget. Or if there was a national emergency, which in this sense usually meant a war, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, for example, when the national emergency was over and the government had needed money in large sums quicker than they could raise taxes and had borrowed it and run deficits, when the war of the national emergency passed, it was expected for the government to run a budget surplus to pay off the debt that had accumulated during the prior crisis period. But first of all, to get that burden off the current as well as the future taxpayers. Now, why was this idea of a balanced budget useful? Because it was argued that it made government more transparent and accountable to the voter citizen. How so? Some politician goes before the voters and say, tell you what I'm going to do. You elect me or re-elect me, and this is what I'm going to give you. That's what I'm going to give you, and I'm going to give you this as well. He had to also say where the money was going to come from, whose taxes were going to be raised, by how much. Would it in fact cover the expenses? Or if he said that he was not going to raise taxes to give some additional or expanded goodie, he was obligated to explain to the voters and certainly to his fellow congressmen in Washington, D.C., what other program was he suggesting cutting or reducing to shift the dollars over to where he wanted spending to be expanded or introduced new for the first time. That was accountability, that you know that your debits are equal to your credits, your expenditures are equal to your inflows. Now, that didn't assure that government was limited to what a classical liberal or a libertarian should consider to be the only minimal things a limited government should do, Jacob. But certainly, it made the cost of government more clear, obvious, and known, so that it act as a brake. And sometimes a brake is useful than not having a brake. It served as a brake that limited the rationale and ability of government to do this. This all changed with the coming of the Great Depression. First, Herbert Hoover, a Republican president, and then certainly with Franklin Roosevelt with his New Deal, the floodgates were open to deficit spending. As you said, this idea was we owe it to ourselves. We're spending to stimulate the economy. The rationale, of course, as I'm sure many listeners and viewers know, came from John Maynard Keynes and the emergent Keynesian revolution. That, no, you don't balance the budget year by year. You balance the budget over the business cycle, You run deficits during recession years to goose the economy. When you're in boom years, you raise taxes to suck inflationary spending out of the economy. And that was their rationale. But the problem is that if you look at the now 70 years since the end of the Second World War, what you find, if you look at a chart of government deficits versus surpluses, that in the 70 years since the end of the Second World War, we have had maybe 6, 7 surpluses, and usually of very minimal size. And all the other years have been deficits, red ink of a larger amount, a lesser amount, a massive amount, like the first years under Obama, but always red ink. Because now that check has been eliminated. The unwritten fiscal constitutional check has been abolished because the politicians, whether Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, can always rationalize another program to help the poor, a stimulus to business, goosing the economy for full employment, subsidizing a domestic competitor to help them face foreign competition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that has opened the Pandora's box of unending government spending. Now, again, a balanced budget rule or even an implicit fiscal unwritten constitution does not guarantee that government will be limited to what an advocate of liberty espouses and advocates. You must make the case to the citizenry as to why government should be small and limited. But that is helped institutionally when you make it clear to the person that any dollar that the government is going to spend is going to have to come out of some taxpayer's pocket, which means he has less to spend on private sector ways, either on consumption or saving and investment to help private sector growth and rising standards of living looking to the future. And that is the danger, the twisted circumstance that we have ourselves in with seemingly no way to get out.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points. Let me address some of them. Going back to the basic idea of the debt ceiling, I think it serves a valuable function in the sense that Congress is saying that too much debt incurred by the government is a bad thing. If it wasn't a bad thing, there wouldn't be a ceiling on it. All a ceiling is saying is, look, here's the maximum that the government can safely incur. It's like a family that says, okay, we can incur $20,000 in debt, but we can't go beyond that because we don't have the income to service that debt. So that's one advantage of the debt ceiling, but the only real practical benefit is that it helps us to remind the American people how bad this thing is. And when even Congress is setting the ceiling, things are bad. Now, you make a very good point when you say that, libertarians want to balance the budget, preferably run a surplus to pay off the debt instead, so that way you're reducing the amount of government debt rather than increasing it. But it's not the ideal because it doesn't raise the important question of what is the role of government in a free society. For example, if we reduce government spending by, let's say, 40%, that would be fantastic. That would mean that there's no more debt that's being added to the current levels of debt. Government might be running a surplus at that point, but you'd still have a DEA in existence. You'd still have welfare agencies in existence. The warfare state would still be in existence. So it's not our ideal, but it is our ideal from a fiscal standpoint, just not from a straight libertarian standpoint. Now, when you talk about the debt being $18 trillion, it's my understanding that this is straight debt, like bonds that are owed by the government, contractual obligations, but that doesn't include the so-called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies. It's my understanding that there's this sense that there's a moral obligation, but it's not a legal obligation because it's a welfare program. There's nothing in any part of any contract that says they have to pay that money like they do with bonds. So they don't include that in the national debt as I understand it. So when Congress is talking about the dangers of a national debt exceeding, say, an arbitrary amount, 15 trillion, 12 trillion, now it's 18 trillion. they're not including all of the unfunded entitlements. And when you add to that, it's my understanding that it's humongous.
Yes. There are two trust funds, as I know you know, for Social Security and Medicare, and they issue annual reports. And they use a 75-year actuarial horizon to estimate how much money will come into those trust funds, Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, and what will be the outflows under current legislation in terms of eligibility, retirement ages, the demographics of aging and the probability of people needing health care and so on. They set up a series of different scenarios, if this, then that, which is reasonable in one sense. And what they basically estimate, Jacob, is that the unfunded liability, that is, obligations to pay over the next 75 years, for which there is no expected money, okay, given the trend line of anticipated taxes, is somewhere between 90 trillion to at least maybe 140 or 150 trillion dollars. Now, of course, that's not all due in 1 year. That's a 75-year actuarial horizon. But since we have an aging population, both to receive Social Security and then, of course, when people like yourself get older, Jacob, and you're going to go to your Medicare support. Can you still hear me, Jacob? The hearing anyway.
What'd you say?
Anyway, the fact is that it's going to be exponentially growing, right? It's going to be exponentially growing because of that aging population. So it may not seem a lot now, but it's going to grow in terms of amounts in future years because of the demographics of the age groups. Now, this is a burden that is difficult to imagine. Now, if I can just go back to one other point in terms of a balanced budget versus deficit spending in general. Milton Friedman used to say quite frequently, well-known free market economist I know many of the viewers and listeners are aware of, used to say that it doesn't matter whether the government funds its spending through either taxes or borrowing. Because the fact is that whether it's from taxes or borrowing, it's real resources collected in one form or another that has to then be shifted to the government and out of the private sector. And at one level of the analysis, that there's so many scarce resources, and it either goes for purpose A, government, or purpose P, the private sector, and that's the case where the government has borrowed the resources or taxed them away. But at another level, and a theme also that James Buchanan and others mentioned, even in the 19th century, the fiscal conservatives of that time, is that deficit spending creates the illusion that government can give the citizenry, if not always something for nothing, less than its actual price tag. The politician can say, I'm going to give you $100 of federal government goodie spending, but it's only going to cost you in any taxes on you or someone else in the 1% or whatever of only $60 for that $100 of goodie spending. The reason being is that the other 40%, in my example, would then be borrowed. So it's not an immediate tax burden. So you create the illusion that government can give something for less than its full cost at the expense of taxes and resources that will be needed to be gotten in some way to fund and provide them, as well as then shifting that fuller cost to both current taxpayers and a future generation of taxpayers in the future, who then will have to pay back that money, assume that it was, in terms of both principal and interest. It's like the snake oil salesman who'd be in the back of the wagon in the 19th century. He said, tell you what I'm going to do. I have this special elixir of life. It's going to make your hair grow. It's going to make you sexier. It'll take away your rheumatism. And all for 50 cents that's the type of con that these politicians are giving people. Elect me, and you'll have $100 worth of things you want, but it's only going to cost you $40 or $60. And that way you're getting, in a sense, something for nothing. And that's the danger with deficit spending, because it creates this bias of people feeling that government has this horn of plenty that really doesn't cost them as much as it will, if not in the present, certainly in the future for someone.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy, the snake oil salesman. I just finished reading an article in the New York Times about the political system in Argentina. And they've disclosed that there's all this vote buying going on, where the candidates are offering this and offering that. It's just a real goodie that they're handing out to people, saying, hey, will you go in there and vote for me? And apparently it's not illegal to do this. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, how is this different from the system here? Of course, the New York Times reporter isn't going to point that out, but it's really no different at all. I mean, this is what the whole welfare state is based on, that, hey, we're going to give a grant for your community. We're going to raise Social Security. We're going to do this. We're going to give you this. We're going to give you that, and vote for us. Or tax benefits to big corporations or bailouts or whatever. I mean, it's a massive vote buying scheme. And it's all with the snake oil salesmen, because ultimately somebody's got to pay for it. And they don't ever say that. Now, I mean, it's really not that difficult to get elected in America, Richard, because all you have to do is say, I'm going to increase government spending and I'm going to lower your taxes. And people sit there and say, wow, what a good deal. And they inevitably fall for the representations of these snake oil salesmen. Now, let me go back to the 19th century to make another point about this, about fiscal responsibility. You know, you had mentioned about there was this tradition of balanced budgets. Well, wasn't it even more than that? That was during the time when gold and silver coins were the official money of the American people under the Constitution. I mean, this notion that the gold standard was paper money backed by gold is nonsense. There was never any paper money. The government didn't have the authority to issue paper money. They could issue debt instruments, but everybody understood that the real money was gold coins and silver coins. So if the government starts issuing too much debt, it was constrained by the fact that people they were owed that money might all show up at the same time saying, we want the gold and silver coins that are represented by these debt instruments. So they couldn't issue massive amounts of debt like they can today. And then, as you pointed out, everything changed during the Great Depression when Roosevelt nationalizes gold, which had been the official money of the American people for some 130 years or so. No constitutional amendment to do that. Makes it illegal to own gold and gold coins by making it a felony if you're caught using them or owning them. And then all of a sudden the floodgates are open, because now you've got this irredeemable fiat money, paper money, promising to pay really nothing at that point. And wasn't that when all of a sudden the debt amounts of the federal government started skyrocketing?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that critics of the gold standard were arguing, certainly from the 1930s on, was the idea that it shackles government. It puts chains on golden fetters, golden fetters that limits government to have the discretion to provide the spending and the purchasing power with paper money created directly by a treasury or created by a central bank that then buys up government bonds and issues the paper money and those purchases those bonds in that way. That a gold standard limits this, because under the gold standard rules, the old days, since gold was money, you deposited the commodity money, gold and or silver, in the bank. The bank would issue you a claim, a note, an IOU representing your title to it. The same way as if you go to the theater and you want to check your hat and your coat during the performance, you take it to the coat room, you get a claim check. At the end of the performance, you come back and either leaving a tip or maybe there's a fee for the convenience, you turn in your claim check and you get your hat and coat back. Well, that's what it was under the gold standard. Gold was the money. The paper currency was not money. It was a money substitute representing the legal right to a particular sum of gold that you had left for safekeeping in a financial institution. Now, that meant that the only way that more units of currency could be issued is if on net there was an increase in the amount of gold deposited by depositors in those institutions, or the amount of currency units in circulation had to be withdrawn. If on net people withdrew gold to hold as coin or bars for whatever reason, domestic use, purchasing something abroad for which the local currency was not a feasible means of transaction, but whatever the reason, the amount of paper currency as money substitutes was limited to the amount of gold in the financial institutions. And that was an important limit on what the government could do, how they could do it, and certainly what their government central bank could try to do for the government by just issuing paper money. And basically, it was narrowly restrained. And that is what they wanted to break. They wanted an unlimited and discretionary power over the handle of the monetary printing press. And that's what they've had. And whether the inflations have been more moderate, more severe, seemingly low, as it seems by the Consumer Price Index nowadays, there's a reason why, since the 1930s and 40s, some economists have called our epoch the age of inflation, because there is this unending ability to print paper money and cumulatively, in one way or another, bring about more moderate or more worse rising price inflation with all of its negative and destructive effects, particularly in the form of the business cycle.
Yeah, wasn't that the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve? I mean, they said, oh, well, it's to stabilize the money supplier, the value of money and so forth. It was really, I think, setting the basis for what then this Federal Reserve was established in 1913, the central bank. And America had lived through most of its history without a central bank. But then it was setting the basis for what happens in the 30s when all of a sudden gold is nationalized and is no longer the official money. And now you got these irredeemable notes.
Right.
The floodgates are open to borrow money. But as that debt starts mounting, it ultimately has to be paid off. And that means ordinarily would mean raising taxes. Well, people don't like paying taxes. They tend to vote politicians out of office who raise taxes. So the Federal Reserve was the perfect opportunity there because they could use the central bank to print the money to pay off the debt. And it's a secret type of system where, as you say, it's not transparent. People don't really know what's going on. It's complicated. And it's reflected by rising prices in society. As your value of your money is going down, that's manifesting itself through rising prices. And so the politicians are brilliant, the bureaucrats. They don't take responsibility for this. They don't say, well, we're debasing the currency by inflating it, by flooding the market with newly printed money whose value is plummeting. They start blaming it on the businessmen where the prices are rising. And it works great. People start condemning the service station owner and the businessman or the corporations, big oil. And then you've got the whip inflation now where we're going to have price controls. And it's a vicious, insidious system, Richard. And I don't see how we can avoid a major crisis. Now we as libertarians, we can't predict when a crisis takes place, but we can say that if you keep following this procedure, you're going to end up with a crisis. And we see this in Greece, which is now bankrupt through out-of-control government spending and debt. And I don't see how that can be avoided here in the United States. And when that crisis comes, and I think it is coming, I can already hear the status saying, this shows you the failure of America's free enterprise capitalist system. It's globalism that's caused this. It's the crisis in Germany or Greece or whatever that's caused this. We need mandatory controls, capital controls. We need more control to save America's free enterprise system. The same nonsense we heard in the 1930s.
See, the very points that you're raising, Jacob, which I totally agree with, explains the importance of the cause and the movement for freedom. America faced a crossroads in the early 1930s. What caused the Great Depression that we're living through? Was it the failure of the banks? Was it greedy businessmen? What was it? The temples of profit that caused it, as particularly Roosevelt tried to paint the picture, though, of course, others have been doing that as well? Or was it precisely because government mismanagement of the monetary system had set the economy on a roller coaster of a boom and a bust that finally went crashing, and then government's interventions of one type under Hoover already, and then certainly in an intricate and massive way by FDR himself, prevented the economy from naturally and effectively rebalancing and recoordinating itself to bring the economy back on an even keel of sustainable restored growth. Now, we have to be doing this ourselves if and when such a crisis comes, which I have the same inclinations without being able to have a crystal ball as to the timing. Which, when we're at the fork again, more government or less government, which will be partly based upon the diagnosis of what has gotten us into the crisis from which we're now at a fork in the road. We have to be explaining effectively in an articulate and persuasive way that is the failure of the interventionist welfare state and monopoly government control of money with monetary central planning that has gotten us into this. It's not a failure of capitalism. It's not the weakness of competitive markets. It's not due to a lack of effective and pervasive enough regulations. It is the state that has caused the dilemma and the crisis we're in, and that the only means to get us on a sounder, sustainable growth and pro-freedom path is to turn away from those government interventions, regulations, and control and reestablish the institutions and the policies of individual liberty, free markets, rule of law, and constitutionally limited government. That will have to be done through a series of legislative repeals and abolitions to free up the market, which of course will include lowering taxes so people can have more money in their pocket, both to have the freedom of their own spending, but to have the sustainable resources to start rebuilding an economy that will have been going through another crisis.
Yeah, and asking that fundamental question that I really wish that the mainstream media would ask every single presidential candidate. What should be the role, the legitimate role of government in a free society? Because as we begin debating that question and discussing it across America, I think a lot of people will start figuring out that much of what the government's doing and has been doing since at least the 1930s, the welfare state and the warfare state and what's going on in the Middle East and so forth, they would arrive at the conclusion this is not the role of government in a genuinely free society. Now, in the matter of monetary central planning, I know we're about out of time, but I think this would be a good time to mention your book that FFF has published. It's an ebook called Monetary Central Planning in the State. If you want to understand these issues, Richard has written an absolutely definitive book in this area. It's absolutely a fantastic book. Richard, sales are going really, really well. I think over 300 copies now have been sold on Kindle, and on top of that, the Kindle Lending Library, people are reading it, and I know that 299 copies are yours that you purchased. As a joke, Richard, just a joke. But it's fantastic, Richard. I think it's really good. So.
Thank you very much. And I if I can sort of toot my own horn, I believe that I have attempted to clearly and in a way for the informed general citizen to understand the logic of the nature of central banking, its political and economic impossibilities and limits, the advantages of moving towards a private, competitive, free banking system, and in that context to also explain the Austrian economists and their theory of money, banking, and the business cycle in comparison to, and in my humble opinion, superior to, either the Keynesian or the monetarist approaches to government intervention and activism in the economy.
Yeah, and it's the grand total of $1 at Amazon, Monetary Central Planning in the State by Richard Ebeling. Fiat money is accepted. And, I mean, as you point out, Richard, we have to take a stand here. I mean, Mises was the one that said that nobody can stand aside from this. Everybody's got a stake. The crisis that looms on the horizon is going to affect everybody. And like I've been telling people now, you may not be able to do anything to stop that crisis, but you can at least get prepared for it, both for yourself and your family. In any event, that's the show. Thanks for tuning in. And, Richard, I will see you next week.